All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started this morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Brittany Goodrich. I'm a cooperative extension specialist here at UC Davis in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department. Thank you for joining us today on this ARE discussion series. So webinars in this series take place on the first and third Tuesday of each month. And we typically host experts from both within and outside the UC to discuss issues facing California's agricultural and natural resource communities. The series is being organized by my fellow UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in Agricultural and Resource Economics. We span 3 campuses. So we have Ellen at UC Berkeley, Mehdi at UC Riverside, and Tina and myself here at UC Davis. Our meeting today will run for an hour. We're going to have some guided Q&A with each of our guests, and then we'll open Q&A up to the audience at the end. So please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom right hand of our screen. Seminars are being recorded and will be available on our website, arediscussions.ucdavis.edu afterwards. So today we have part 2 of our Sustainable Groundwater Management Act discussion. It should be a really interesting session today. If you missed the last one, that is available on our website, so go check that out. But today we are going to be talking with Dr. Brad Franklin and Dr. Stephen Wallander about managed aquifer recharge as one approach to comply with SGMA sustainability targets. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mehdi to talk with Dr. Brad Franklin first.
Thank you, Brad, for joining us today. Can you share your slides? So if to start, after give you a few seconds. Okay, perfect.
Hopefully that's good.
That's not okay. That's perfect. So, Brad, can you tell us a little bit about the SGMA policy context and the potential role for managed aquifer recharge?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'd just like to say I work at the Nature Conservancy and kind of representing work that a lot of my colleagues have done today and not presenting my own original research. So just that caveat aside, then yeah, thinking about kind of SGMA context and just to define our terms up ahead at the front here, you know, when I talk about managed aquifer recharge, I'm just simply referring to surface water being used to recharge groundwater. And so, yeah, there are many kind of known benefits to MAR. And so when you think about improving security of water supply over the long term, and then it's sort of a passive kind of process in the sense that you can kind of let the aquifer clean up some, you know, water quality issues, and there's, you know, very little relative, you know, once kind of infrastructure is in place, low cost and low energy requirements, but then yeah, in terms of SGMA, of course, the big thing is, you know, it would be great if we could use this to replenish the overexploited aquifers, and so yeah, as we all know, you know, in the SGMA process, you know, the critically overdrafted basins have already submitted their plans, and then the next round, I believe, is due in 2022 for slightly lower priority basins. But many of these critically overdrafted basins are incorporating aquifer recharge as one of the kind of solutions for hitting their sustainability targets. And then also there's kind of the state's efforts where you have the flood MAR program, which is, you know, the idea there is to ideally capture, you know, high flow flooding, you know, high surface flows and store them in aquifers, and therefore decrease risk of flooding. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Perfect. And that's great. And what are some of the key takeaways from economics literature on managed aquifer recharge?
Yeah, okay. So I maybe have this may be a highly idiosyncratic kind of view of the literature, but I'm very kind of California centric too. But I mean, like the first paper I think of was a paper by Knapp and Olson, and where they did this theoretical model, and then they applied it to Kern County, where they accounted for the randomness of surface water flows, of all possible surface water to use in Kern County. And the surprising thing about that paper is this pretty negative in the sense that they found that really it was never optimal to do managed aquifer recharge. And part of it is sort of a very complicated paper, but one of the reasons for that is that there's already deep percolation due to, from irrigation on the land. You're already getting some recharge. So that kind of mitigates some of the benefits from doing additional recharge. And then the next paper here, I threw in here, so Stephen's co-author on this, so I won't speak too much about this, but I kind of wanted to check my logic here, thinking about, okay, I've got a kind of this California view of the world, but here's a study from Arkansas, okay, and where they did sort of deterministic analysis, right? So it's a little bit different setup from the other paper, but also, the interesting thing to me, the takeaway was that, yeah, they found that managed aquifer recharge could be useful under some circumstances, but it basically needs to be quite cheap in order to make a significant difference in terms of refilling the aquifer, okay? So again, kind of like, yeah, I mean, managed aquifer recharge kind of sounds great in principle when you think about the benefits of, on the previous slide. But when you get down to kind of weighing the costs and benefits, it's not always clear how beneficial it'll be. And then the last paper here, just Ami Resnick and Ariel Dinar. So this was another one, this is from the Central Valley. And in this case, they did find some benefits from managed aquifer recharge, but it really depends on the institutional context. So they went really in depth thinking about different institutional arrangements and also about uncertainty about climate. So yeah, so this is kind of my view of the literature, and I think Stephen will probably have a better take. I look forward to seeing what he says in his lecture. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. And so based on what you have been working on, is managed aquifer recharge a cost-effective solution for meeting some of the SGMA restrictions?
Sure. So yeah, so the last slide I've kind of thinking more from a theoretical perspective, but then, given the kind of real world context of SGMA and California water policy, of course, there are many different options for addressing these goals, right? But so this slide is sort of a simple representation of thinking about a few different options. And, from the right to the left, basically you've got more infrastructure, more technology, and then consequently, typically significant costs, right? And then going towards the left, you're getting down to less and less infrastructure and more decentralized. And so that's where, managed aquifer recharge, looks good in many respects compared to big infrastructure projects, right? And so, and then in terms of dynamic recharge at the end, sort of the cheapest option that is laid out here, this is where TNC is kind of focused. And I'll get into some of the details of that. But then I'll just point out that, the FloodMAR also kind of fits in here, and that some of the funding, the recent water bond, or Proposition 1 water bond, there was funding provided for recharge and for surface water projects, but a couple of those surface water projects have really not borne out in terms of they're seeing very high costs. And so, I mean, that just kind of further reinforces this kind of cost dynamic in terms of thinking about some of these options in California. But then, okay, so, I mean, in this sense, again, managed aquifer recharge looks pretty good. But then, the PPIC, among others, has done a kind of good job of kind of going through the groundwater sustainability plans, kind of documenting things and then analyzing that, right? And so one of the takeaways from from their work is that, hey, yeah, okay, this blue box here to the left, recharge projects. Okay, when you kind of add up all these plans, what you see is that there's plans to do about 1 million acre feet of groundwater recharge per year. Okay, and that's a big number. Okay, and they point out, and then to the right, they point out that, the time period when water is available to do recharge is fairly concentrated, narrow time period, and you've got to have the capacity in terms of infrastructure and the management all in place in order to quickly capitalize that and use that water. So, so I think, the takeaway here is that, there's real, we might want to temper our expectations for how much we can achieve at the aggregate kind of state level using managed aquifer recharge.
Perfect, thank you. And can you give us a little bit more detail on some of the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing in this area and some of the examples across California?
Sure, yeah. So, so as I said, the Nature Conservancy, of course, we're kind of conservation-oriented organization, and we're into our philosophy is to try to promote nature-based solutions where you're kind of taking advantage of natural systems and naturally occurring processes and using those to our advantage and to be policy goals and whatever. So, so bird returns is really the flagship program that TNC has in this area, where it starts with the bird providing habitat for shorebirds. And so this picture is just showing some fields that participated in one of our trials in 2018. And then you can see that in the background, the neighboring farms are pretty much dry. And the point of this program is to provide habitat to birds cheaply when they need it. So we're on the Pacific, what is it, the flyway, Pacific Flyway, right? And so birds migrate up and down the coast. And we know that, since irrigation became prevalent in California till today, we've basically dried up over 95% of the wetlands that were originally here. So that has a big negative impact on migrating birds. And TNC, although, it's a big organization, it doesn't have money to kind of to buy all the land needed for this, to kind of reconstruct anything like the original kind of wetlands that were available. So the idea here is, can we be flexible and kind of dynamic and just essentially pay farmers to participate when the habitat is needed, which is in the spring and fall, and provide just enough water for the birds that they can take advantage of it. And so we use a reverse auction system to do this. And then we have a model for evaluating the bids and how cost effective they are given the ecological metrics that we have in place. And then, so this program has been in place for a while, and it's mostly concentrated in Sacramento Valley, working with rice growers, but we're looking to kind of expand this across California. And okay, so that's, you might say that's great, but all you're talking about is birds. What about the recharge? So our approach is basically to build up incrementally. So kind of bird habitat is sort of our anchor. And then we're trying to demonstrate the value of, via ongoing projects and prospective future work, of then the additional co-benefits. If you site this in the right place, you could potentially get good groundwater recharge and flood risk reduction. Okay, so that would be kind of ideal if you could get all those things for some areas of California, right? But then we're also discovering there are other possible co-benefits, which, so in the case of, for the landowners, participating in these trials, we've seen reduced need for herbicides because they can kind of suppress the weed growth. So yeah, so that is really our, the way we're approaching this is to try to capture all the co-benefits, with groundwater recharge being one of the key ones.
Perfect. Thank you, Brad. And to conclude, can you talk a little bit about the policy implications, extension, and applications of managed aquifer recharge?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to sort of by way of explanation, I'll just give a little detail on one of our projects was up in Colusa County, and just thinking about what kind of factors need to align for one project to work, and then how kind of replicable is that to other areas, and then what are the policy implications, right? And so in this trial, I mean, so first thing is what crops the farmers are growing is really important. So for our purposes, orchards are not suitable at all because birds won't stay there because they have very limited visibility. And then so we've been working really with rice growers a lot, but rice growers tend to be in areas that kind of maybe more clay soils that kind of retain the water so the water stands there, which doesn't sound like the best place for recharge. So then you kind of have to thread the needle here of finding some place that, okay, you have the right mix of crops and the soil, you will get a recharge benefit, right? So we use a SAGB index to kind of evaluate that. But then also, what is the aquifer like? What kind of benefits are you likely to see? In this case, there's a really compelling case for aquifer recharge, right? Because there's a cone of depression around Arbuckle and there's subsidence nearby. But then on top of that, you have to kind of have the surface water lined up. Okay, do you have surface water available? Can you also have some benefits from flood risk reduction? In this case, it's not possible because of the way they operate the conveyance infrastructure. And then on top of all that, you have to have willing farmers who you have to pay, or at least in the demonstration trial phase, you need to pay those farmers to kind of cooperate, right? So that's complicated. And then this slide is just really to highlight the institutional complexity involved with that also. I mean, that kind of blob in the middle here is just showing all organizations and different parties involved to pull off this one project, right? And so there's a ton of planning and planning costs involved in pulling this off. And water rights are a huge issue, as always with California water rights, right? It's always the problem, or a big problem. But yeah, so you have to have permits to use the surface water in the way you intend, and then you also have to establish the credits for. So I mean, great, you want to recharge the aquifer, great, but can you actually capture any benefits from that, right? If the local farmers are going to be incentivized, they need to see some benefit, or you have to pay them, right? So that's a huge challenge. And how you kind of streamline this and possibly, I don't know, kind of bureaucratically, is it possible to simplify this process to make it easier to replicate? But my understanding is that for TNC, this is the biggest issue, the kind of dealing with the water rights. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. And so then sort of building off that and just thinking, as an economist, what needs to be done and where do we go with this? The second point, really that's where people like me and perhaps other economists on this call kind of come in, who really want to demonstrate the benefits of as fully as possible. And so from our perspective, TNC, this involves, okay, all the kind of capturing all the co-benefits when you're thinking about nature plus human benefits, right? But then we've kind of done this in Sacramento Valley, and the rice growers kind of have incentives to do this from, it's a really kind of good kind of branding stewardship kind of thing for them to participate, right? But then, to move beyond Sacramento Valley to the Bay Delta and San Joaquin Valley, very different crops grown, different issues that they face. And it's a challenge, to kind of demonstrate the incentives, the value of it, and how do you incentivize farmers without always having to pay them, right? And so that brings me to the last point, is that really, if we and other, all of us collectively can kind of demonstrate the benefits and catalog them, then we've got a strong case for then, pursuing further public funding to promote these kind of programs. And the model that I have in mind is state money that would go to GSAs, which would then they would kind of work with the farmers locally. And yeah, so that's just my take on things. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad. That's great. I will pass it to Ellen and Stephen for further discussion on this, and then to the audience, please submit your questions to the Q&A for after the discussions we have with Ellen and Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Mehdi, and thanks so much, Brad. Sort of building off of some of that, we're excited to have Stephen Wallander here, who's an economist at the USDA's Economic Research Service. Brad sort of alluded to some of Stephen's work that we're going to talk about today. So I don't know if Stephen, you want to go ahead and throw up your slides there, but we're excited to learn more about your research on managed aquifer recharge. And so to kick it off, would love to hear your take on sort of how economists think about managed aquifer recharge, and sort of if you could explain how your work sort of fits into this broader discussion, that would be great.
Great. Well, thank you all for inviting me to this. I was asked to come and talk about a research paper that Brad talked about, that was the one that Dot Tron is lead on and Kent Kovac are on, and that had to do with looking at managed recharge in the Arkansas basin, Mississippi alluvial basin in Arkansas. And it's part of a bigger project where we've been working with folks at UC Davis, with Helen Dahlke and other hydrologists there, and also at UC Riverside with Ariel Dinar and Ami Resnick. That paper was also cited to try to look at these managed recharge issues in a lot of different areas. And so, you know, I guess when we're thinking about it from the economist perspective, you know, obviously we're thinking about the costs and benefits, the incentives that are involved, the fixed costs, the cost of acquiring the water, the cost of moving the water, waiting for the benefits to accrue. But what really is driving a lot of those changes as incentives is this mix of groundwater and surface water resources that you have in a given region, right? And you really need both, because managed recharge is relying on the substitutability of the two. And so the frequency and scale of your water shortages and your surpluses really define your setting and your incentives. So to start off, I just wanted to throw up some stuff from different ERS reports we've done, looking at irrigation, looking at groundwater. When I'm trying to explain at a national level the regional differences in these incentives, I tend to divide things up into 5 regions. And so, you know, when we're talking today about California and SGMA, we're in the Mountain West. You've got these areas where the red counties, cropland shown here, you know, 75 to 100% of the land that's harvested is irrigated. If you're growing crops in those areas, you're irrigating, and you're using a mix of surface water and groundwater. If you're in the high plains, there's much less surface water to work with. It's almost entirely groundwater. Doing recharge there is very different. It has to do with playa lakes and things like that. Our research that Dot and Kent were lead on was really looking at this system in the Mississippi alluvial aquifer, where you actually have a tremendous amount of irrigation. A lot of these counties where the majority of the cropland is irrigated, it's predominantly groundwater there, but that's mostly because you don't have the infrastructure to move the surface water resources to the farms yet. But there is a lot of surface water resources there in the way there isn't in the high plains. Getting back to California, we see that you do have this trade-off between surface water and groundwater. This is from the Farm and Ranch Irrigation Survey, and showing applied water on the farm and where it's coming from. And you see, like in 1997, there was a lot of additional water available. And so groundwater withdrawals went down. And so you see that substitution occurring even before managed recharge is on the scene. When you look at the USGS numbers for the groundwater levels in the Central Valley, you see a lot of periods of significant unmanaged recharge. This dark blue line is looking down at the Tulare Basin, right? And so you see during these wet years, not only did you get reduced groundwater withdrawals, you were getting very significant recharge. This was before a lot of the shift to drip and micro irrigation, so you had a lot of inefficient surface irrigation that you were getting recharge from, but it shows you that recharge is possible during those wet years. To move to the surface water side and look at deliveries in California, what we really start to look for is that water available? So this is looking at deliveries to agriculture from the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, and basically looking at deviations from the average. And you can see that, yes, you have quite a few years where you've got 20 or 40% above average deliveries from these systems, but you can see that the curtailments you get during the big drought years can be much larger than that. So they can be on the order of 40 to 60% reduction in agricultural deliveries from those systems. And so that's where you get that substitution to groundwater, and you get a lot of that overdraft in parts of the system.
Thank you. Yeah, so could you elaborate a bit more on like how MAR can impact a farmer's pumping and planting decisions? I mean, you brought up how it's all about this mix of incentives between groundwater and surface water. So how should we be thinking about MAR impacting a farmer's pumping decisions, and how does that influence how we think about MAR?
Sure, and that's a core part of some of the economic modeling here, where you're trying to do these integrated hydrologic economic models. And so the Arkansas research, what Dot and Kent and I were kind of looking at was this question of, if you do a significant amount of managed recharge and you locate it optimally and you really do change groundwater levels and groundwater availability relative to the baseline, what sort of compensating behavior do you have? How does that offset things, right? And so, we think that farmers are going to make their crop decisions and their water application decisions in response to the cost of water, and the cost of water is going to depend upon how far you have to lift it, how much you have to pump it. And the real finding, to come out of this is that MAR can lead to kind of two different types of benefits, right? You can recharge the water and leave it in the ground. Don't withdraw it, raise the groundwater level, increase your sustainability, and you reduce pumping costs for everybody. Or you can recharge the water and you can use it at a future date. And that's what we referred to as slippage in these studies. It's two papers that I'll be talking about. And so, that increased use could come through higher application rates or expansion of irrigated acreage. And the question then is, you're going to get a mix of these when you recharge, right? Some of the water you put back in is probably going to get used. How much, and how much is going to lead to recovery of groundwater levels? To get at this, we use this dynamic partial equilibrium model where you have a profit maximization problem and you're trying to decide how much irrigation water to use, how to allocate the land. In this case, it's between 4 different irrigated crops and 2 dry land options. And where do you do the recharge and how much do you recharge? And this model runs for 120 years on 2,000 grid cells. And so that basically what makes it dynamic is that the recharge decisions you're making now influence your groundwater extraction paths and your land use choices in the future. Here's the sort of main result, is that the results are highly dependent upon how much it's going to cost you to recharge. These red lines are what happens when you have very inexpensive recharge on the order of $20 per acre foot. What you're going to start doing in those cases is do a bunch of recharge in the early years. And then as you gradually replenish the aquifer, the benefits of recharge are going to go down as things fill back up. And so you're going to do less and less recharge over time. But then there's a tipping point when you move to the medium priced recharge options of $40 to $60 an acre foot, where at current groundwater levels, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do recharge. But as you continue to draw the system down, the benefits of recharge increase. And so you start doing more and more recharge over time. And so your recharge increases over time in this sort of optimal model. If it's too expensive to do the recharge, in that area it came out at about $80 per acre foot. You do almost no recharge over the entire time frame. The slippage result was sort of basically saying, and this is that behavioral question you were asking about, Ellen, is that, you know, what happens in terms of the compensating behavior? When you have really inexpensive recharge, you get significant increases, particularly in rice and in irrigated soybeans and cotton. And that's coming out of this dry land and fallow land. You still get that effect. It tends to be a little bit more towards corn for the medium priced recharge options, but it's also smaller because you're having a smaller impact on the groundwater levels.
Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. Yeah, so could you elaborate a little bit more on like how this interacts with drought scenarios?
Yeah, so in the second paper of this pair of studies, we wanted to look at, you know, what happens over time. We know that under a lot of the climate scenarios, what we're expecting to see is sort of increased either drought frequency or drought severity or a combination of the two. And so in addition to this shifting, this slippage across sort of laterally across the land, right, where you're bringing additional land into irrigation, what sort of slippage might you get over time? And is it going to provide a buffer against those increased drought frequency and things like that? So just a little bit of background. This is kind of how we think about drought risk from a report we did at ERS a while back. And, you know, this is looking over historical periods. You have in sort of the Southwest and Southern Texas, these areas where you're getting a severe or extreme drought once every 2 or once every 3 years. Whereas if you're in a lot of areas in the Midwest, you may be getting a severe or extreme drought once every 5 years or less. And so they're facing less drought risk in those areas. And, you know, interestingly, we think of the Mississippi system as being much less drought prone, but as you move into the Southeast, it's kind of in the middle in terms of how much drought they experience. The slippage results were that in this setting with the drought, increased frequency and increased severity, were that under the low cost scenario, you have only less than a third of your water goes to slippage, goes to benefits from increased withdrawals in the future, and about 70% of it remains in the aquifer. That gets reversed basically when you move to the mid-cost scenarios. Only about a third of the water remains in the aquifer, and the majority of it gets used through increased water withdrawals relative to the baseline in the future. Drought, it sort of exacerbates that, but only moderately. And particularly with increased frequency, you get a little bit of increased slippage through more frequent drought. And you get some increased slippage through increased severity, but mainly when you're in that low cost managed recharge scenario.
Okay, thank you. So how do these results translate to policy? What are some of the implications?
So I was sort of trying to think about this, what this would mean in light of Sigma and this trade-off between the two things, the two places you can really get benefits from the managed recharge. And it's this real trade-off, right? If you're trying to use managed recharge to meet the sustainability goals and your baseline situation is where you expect to have continued overdraft, right? That's not compatible with using managed recharge to expand water use. So if farmers face land use, crop choice, irrigation decisions with respect to groundwater where they can make the kind of decisions that led to the slippage the model predicted for Arkansas, it doesn't really meet your sustainability goals. So for it to fit into a Sigma policy setting, right, you need the managed recharge to work in tandem with some sort of acreage and pricing policies that are going to potentially restrict that sort of excess withdrawals if what you're trying to do is bring groundwater levels back up. Critical to all of this, as we saw in the Arkansas case, is finding low-cost managed recharge options such as AgMar, you know, on-field flooding of land that remains in production. Finding those opportunities is critical. A big part of it in the Central Valley is sort of where that water comes from. In the Arkansas setting, it was very much about sort of getting it from often sort of stream side infiltration, sort of pumping in the interaction zone between the stream and the aquifer. In the Central Valley, it's about moving water, right? The way water has always been about in this area. And so the question is, are you going to try to move it from the Sacramento Basin, or are you going to try to move it from some of this water that's coming off of the Sierras from the east, say if we're talking about the Tulare Basin where you have a lot of the overdraft? To get an idea of how these two benefits could play out, we threw together this chart where it was sort of historical irrigated acreage in California. And we had some projected reductions in acreage from Jay Lund that he wrote it in about 2016, saying if we're going to comply with SGMA, we're going to have to reduce irrigated acreage by around 2 million acres. And so what that assumes then that you're complying with SGMA, you've met your sustainability goals. So in that case, if you stacked managed recharge on top of that, you could start to bring that acreage back into production. And so that slippage would be the point of doing the recharge. But you would have had these other policies that were bringing you to meet the sustainability goals. The challenge in California is that you've got a much more complex set of crops that you're dealing with, and irrigation technologies and water sources, right? So this was a chart we did during the droughts in 2015, 2014 to try to explain to people how complicated California is. And what the way this works is sort of that you have the different crops and the size of the circles or how much water they use. If you're moving up towards the top, you're mostly surface water irrigated. So cotton and rice are getting almost all of their water off of the federal and state systems. For all those crops in the middle, like the orchards and the hay and the corn silage, they're getting their water from both groundwater and surface water deliveries. And then the technology is what you've got moving left to right. So if you're all the way over on the right, you're doing flood irrigation. If you're over on the left, you're doing micro or sprinkler, which impacts the ability to do that on-field agmar, right? And so figuring out how this all fits together and how the benefits accrue to the different crops is really challenging in the California setting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so do you have any, final sort of key takeaways for water managers looking to implement on-farm recharge and the like?
Yeah, so on this, I want to highlight some policy changes that have happened at the federal level, and how the incentives for managed recharge are increasing. And I also want to give sort of a brief overview of some of the research that we're doing with Helen Dahlke at Davis and her team. On the incentives piece, the 2018 Farm Act has really changed the setting here quite a bit. It's directed the major working lands programs to really focus on surface and groundwater conservation in a way that they haven't before. It's also given NRCS the ability to work directly with irrigation organizations and to put projects in locations and practices in locations that aren't necessarily on farm. And so that really opened things up. And it specifically indicated a desire on Congress's part for NRCS to work on managed recharge explicitly. So you get those increase in incentives, then you get into this really challenge of, okay, what would optimal managed recharge look like across the Central Valley? And so this is a result from a set of hydrologic simulations where we're basically saying, let's imagine that you had a certain amount of recharge that you're going to do across the valley. Where would you put it? Where would you take the water out of the hydrologic system? And then where would you try to put it back into the groundwater system? And in essence, this is a scenario where you're pulling water out of a bunch of diversion points in the north, and you're moving it into mostly into the San Joaquin Basin and a little bit in the Tulare Basin. And so you're having to move the water pretty far. But obviously, the hydrology really matters for where you put that water into the system, how much it accrues, and how much it interacts with the streams and other things like that. And so what you're trying to do here is maximize the amount of water that you're recharging. So on these blue and red dots, you're trying to move as far to the right as possible. You're also trying to reduce the distance you're moving the water. That's kind of a proxy for cost and for water loss. So you want to be towards the bottom. So ideally, you want to be as far to the right and as far down as you can be. So if you end up with a MAR portfolio where you're recharging and you're at one of these blue scenarios, right, you can obviously do better. But eventually you sort of start to hit that frontier where you have to make a trade-off between quantity and cost. And so the idea here is to try to sort of map out that frontier and figure out what the different MAR portfolios might look like at different scales of MAR. And the challenge in a sigma setting, right, is that these managed recharge decisions aren't necessarily going to be being made valley-wide. And that's a lot of the work that Ariel Denara and Ami Resnick were working on, right, is that the institutional settings matter because it's going to be these local groundwater districts that are making some of the investment decisions and the location decisions. So, and that was where I wanted to stop. So.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. And I'm going to pass it off to Tina, who I think is going to moderate the questions in the Q&A for both of you.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate everybody typing in their questions in the Q&A box as the webinar has been going along, but please continue to enter questions and I'll try and get to as many as possible. Let's start off with a question that I think both of you are well poised to answer. So we've talked in both of your presentations about both the benefits and the costs of MAR. And so certainly looking at a lot of the economic efficiency issues, but as economists, what can we say about the distributional and equity issues associated with MAR?
I guess I could try to go first. It's a great question. It's something I haven't personally gotten that far analyzing, but yeah, I mean, with the whole context of Sigma, I mean, distributional issues are a big problem. So you have disadvantaged communities and you have small farmers, which may have shallow wells. And so we're concerned, I know the TNC is concerned about thinking about, so groundwater, so to the extent that there are groundwater dependent ecosystems, that's kind of one level of abstraction. They are sort of analogous to some of these disadvantaged communities in the sense that they're both potentially vulnerable to changing pumping patterns over the aquifer, and especially when you think about some of these basins where water markets are part of the solution. And okay, water markets sound great, but what happens if you get concentrated pumping in one part of the aquifer? So you have big almond growers, let's say, and that could possibly have negative consequences. So there's that spatial externality, which is a big issue. And I don't know, how, to what extent, MAR can rectify that. I mean, it depends on the local hydrogeology, and I can't really speak to that. Maybe Stephen has a better answer to that question, but that's where I'll leave it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's definitely an issue because of, where you recharge the water influences where the future benefits accrue. And so it has a lot of flavor to the discussions that have been going on about water rights and water trading and water leasing in California. And so likely not only do you have these equity issues, but you likely have third-party impacts as well, because essentially it involves moving and transferring water over time as well as space.
Great. Thanks to you both. Both of you mentioned in your talks the role of crops in managed aquifer recharge and the complexity of California in that we have so many crops potentially available to engage in this. Also, Bradley, you mentioned that orchards weren't suitable from a TNC perspective because of the birds, but can you each elaborate on what crops, and obviously crops are co-located with soil types, which is obviously a large determinant of the effectiveness of management aquifer recharge. Could you guys talk about what crops might be the most effective or efficient at MAR, and also farmers' perceptions, and what groups of farmers might be the most suitable to participate in MAR?
So I mean, as I've said, rice has kind of been where Nature Conservancy is focused, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It kind of makes sense to start there. That's in some sense kind of like low-hanging fruit. Like, yeah, okay, that makes sense from our perspective. But then to be replicable, kind of to scale up to anything kind of at the state level, okay, rice isn't a big crop over the whole state, right? And so I know that TNC has, I think, also talked to Helen Dahlke, who Stephen's been working with, about alfalfa, and that is perhaps a viable option going forward. Corn, I think, is another option. So from TNC's perspective, you want field crops, but then so you want to be able to flood in the sort of in the off season. And so sorry, someone on the Q&A thing asked about, does this require land fallowing? And the answer is no. The idea behind TNC's approach is after you harvest, that's when it'd be, to the extent that, first, at least for rice, it coincides with when the habitat need is, right? So in the shoulder seasons. And so it's really only like 2 or 3 week period. It's actually a very small time period that the birds will use that habitat. Okay, so kind of we've done that with rice, and I don't know, alfalfa is a deceptively complicated crop because you have so many rotations over the year, so many harvests across the year, right? So that gets complicated, but then, ideally other crops like alfalfa and corn would be suitable, but it's sort of a work in progress from our perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think a lot of it is still learning. If you're trying to do AgMar and you're trying to stack water on fields in the off season to minimize your costs, you are trying to minimize the yield impact on the subsequent growing season. And so you're looking for crops and locations where there will be a minimum amount of yield impact, but you're still going to get a significant amount of recharge from those sites. Some of the field studies on being able to stack water on alfalfa are just astounding, how much water they're able to recharge on some sites with very limited yield loss. I think they're starting to find that if orchards are established in a particular way, you can actually, for some orchards, you can stack a fair amount of water on the orchard in the winter and get a fair amount of recharge that way, but it's very site dependent. And of course, there's always the option of some of the recharge being done on land that is in a recharge basin, and so you have, in that case, right, you have significant opportunity cost, the land, you have significant capital costs of building the basins, but a lot of the MAR projects that have been done to date that have fairly high recharge rates are those more capital intensive projects. And it's, ultimately it's going to be a mix of those things. But I think, I think one of the actually interesting unexplored questions on this with orchards, and it relates not just to the managed recharge, but to the water use, is how you deal with the age class distribution and the cohorts in your orchards, right? Because what we saw in the 2014 and 2015 drought was that a lot of the almonds were getting pulled out early because the young young non-bearing trees have such lower water requirements that they were basically adjusting their age class distribution to adapt to a severe drought. And you could imagine you could make similar calculations if you were managing orchards as part of a MAR portfolio.
Thanks so much. Actually, cost came up a couple times in your answer, Stephen, and we have a couple questions about cost specifically in the Q&A. So one is, what are the main determinants of costs of MAR? And then a follow-up is, once water is actually placed into either federal or state water projects, does cost really increase with distance? And so I'll open that up to the both of you. And
okay. Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, I think you start with the cost of the water itself. You know, a lot of the MAR projects are looking for these flood flows that are unadjudicated, that you're not having to really purchase the water, so the actual acquisition cost for the water is really low. The other place some of the MAR projects look is to treated water. And so if you can get the nice thing about treated water is that it's a fairly regular flow. And so when you invest in a MAR project, you know you're going to be able to use it frequently. So that's the frequency of use is a second important part of the cost, because it's kind of what I think about as the mall parking lot problem, right? Like, you want to build these facilities, you know you're going to get these peak flows, and you want to build these facilities to get as much of that water back into the ground as you can. But some of those peak flows only occur once every 20 or once every 30 years. So is the capital investment really worth it to get the water to those sites if they're not going to be used for recharge that frequently? And that's a really tough trade-off. And moving the water is costly. I think even if you get it into the systems and you're moving long distances, you have friction losses, you have conveyance losses, and in many cases, you do end up still having some pumping lift at some point along the way. And so there are conveyance costs, even if you're lucky enough to have good recharge sites where it's predominantly gravity fed.
Yeah, sorry, that was an excellent answer by Stephen. The only thing I would add is that we think about AgMAR, just that there is additional labor, and there could be potential costs borne by the landowners, and there's the issues of how to manage appropriately for multiple objectives. Thanks.
Sure. Great answers, both of you. This question was actually directed at Bradley and asks about studies that were specifically conducted for sustainable conservation that identify benefits and beneficiaries, and look at costs per acre foot for recharge in the San Joaquin Valley, and how those studies kind of fit into that brief literature review you did and your synopsis.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm kind of, I hit the answer live button. I think still learning how to deal with the this kind of Zoom Q&A format. But really, I wanted to ask Richard, who submitted the question, if he could submit a link. I'm not sure. I don't think I'm familiar with what he's referring to, but if he could post any links for everybody's benefit, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. No problem. So I think this one's really for both of you. In addition to crop type, this questioner was also looking at irrigation systems. So are growers that are still using flood irrigation in a better position possibly for MAR compared to operations that have converted to subsurface drip or sprinklers? And how does that kind of play out potentially in the kind of distributional impacts of potential for MAR?
Yeah, I think definitely your irrigation technology has a big impact on sort of your ability to do on-field recharge. And I think anecdotally there's some discussion about people saying they need to bring back hybrid systems, and they need to be able to use micro or drip when they want to, and they need to be able to flood when they want to. And of course, that then is another type of cost that influences it. But and when you look at that historical unmanaged recharge that you have in the Central Valley, you can see that sort of historically. And it was, you know, I think from a water conservation perspective, we thought of these systems as highly inefficient, but it's not just in the Central Valley. You know, in Western Nebraska, in Idaho, you have other areas where there are significant amounts of unmanaged recharge that occurred over the past 50 to 100 years because of the way they manage their irrigation systems. And as they shifted over to more efficient systems, they've seen their groundwater levels start to decline, and they've said, oh, wait, what have we done? And the other place where this comes into play is on lining the canals, right? There are situations where if you have enough knowledge of the underlying hydrology, you might want to leave canals unlined. You might view losses, seepage losses, as a benefit depending on the system that they're seeping into.
Right. Yeah. I don't, that's again, great answer by Stephen. I just, you know, sometimes the economics of irrigation can kind of be counterintuitive because you see slippage that Stephen alluded to, and the, you know, related, like, you know, Frank Ward had this PNAS study where in the Rio Grande basin, where basically, yeah, irrigation efficiency sounds great, but then if you don't have controls on irrigated acreage and intensity, what crops are grown, you could actually see increased consumptive use. So they're yeah, it can be tricky and counterintuitive, but yeah, that's great. Thanks.
All right, so our final question for the day that I'll pose, because we're about a minute till our conclusion, is asking about each of your senses of the effectiveness of current policies. So for example, EQIP, which Stephen talked about a little bit, to incentivize farmers to be essentially capable of AgMAR and achieving kind of MAR goals broadly.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say one of the lessons we've learned from decades of investing in irrigation efficiency improvements, and as we start to think about the incentives for managed recharge, and we're in situations where you have groundwater overdraft, the fundamental underlying incentive problem is the open access resource of the groundwater. And so, you know, the Ward study that I was just talking about, right? The issue is if you don't solve the open access issue, these other issues are unlikely to be particularly effective. And so the interesting thing about SGMA coming in is that it has the potential, and it's going to probably play out differently basin by basin as they come up with their plans. It has the potential to address the open access issue. And that's where then MAR fits in as a piece of the puzzle. It gives them another tool to work with. But MAR in and of itself, just like irrigation efficiency improvements by themselves, are not going to solve the open access problem.
Yeah, no, good answer. I don't think I have much to add to that point, but thank you.
Great, thanks both of you, and I'll turn it over to Brittany to conclude.
All right, thank you both for being here. Sorry, and thanks for everyone who attended. Please join us for our next webinar on December 1st, where we're going to talk about some of the trade turmoil that's been going on over the last couple of years and its impact on California's tree nut and dairy industries. So we'll have Dr. Dan Sumner and Tristan Hannon from UC Davis, and then also Ali Amin, who is the CEO of Primex International Trading Corp., who is a dried fruit and nut trading company. So please join us, and thank you all for attending. You can find more information on our website, which is arediscussions.ucdavis.edu. Thanks, everyone.